I see him stamp thus and call thus. Come on, you cowards! You were born in fear, though you were born in Rome.
Now, put your shields before your hearts, and fight with hearts more proof than shields. Advance, my fellows!
Was ever man so proud as is this Martius?
Come, you have been too rough. You must return and mend it. Let them hang!
Let thy mother rather feel thy pride than fear thy dangerous stubbornness.
The common cry of curs! Whose breath I hate, as reek of the rotten fens, whose loves I prize as the dead carcasses of unburied men that do corrupt my air. I banish you!
So if you haven't recognized him, there is Tom Hiddleston in the 2015 National Theatre production of Coriolanus that was staged in London. And we'll have occasion to look at some of those scenes in more detail next week. But for now, I want to introduce the play to you, and particularly to give you some important historical context. Since this is an unusual play in many ways, it's a play that's not frequently taught, but many students have told me, as I've placed in the caption to the PowerPoint, that it's the best play you've never read. It's a play that reflects Shakespeare's late tragic vision. This is one of his last tragedies, written and performed in 1608. And it introduces themes that we're already familiar with from King Lear and The Winter's Tale, themes particularly of political misrule. This is another play in our unit on the broken body politic. It's a play about greed. It's a play about opportunism. It's a play about valor, particularly martial or military valor. It's a play about loyalty. It's a play about nationhood, in this case not ancient Britain, but ancient Rome. It's also a play about economic injustice, a play that introduces an ongoing debate between the popular will and political authority. And we'll be discussing all of those topics more as we move into the play next week. But for now, I just want to establish for you some key context, because when Shakespeare writes a play like Coriolanus, and this is a tragedy, but it's a tragedy that also smacks of chronicle history, much in the way that Julius Caesar or Antony and Cleopatra does, in the sense that Shakespeare's dealing with material from the historical record, in this case a historical record having to do with ancient Rome. And Coriolanus is one of Shakespeare's several Roman plays, which include Antony and Cleopatra and Coriolanus. The authoritative book on Shakespeare's Roman plays is actually Roman Shakespeare, which has been written by Kapilia Khan, who's coming to visit us in a couple of weeks. So we want to be mindful that this play works always simultaneously in two contexts, in two political contexts. One context concerns the subject matter that the play takes up, its setting in Republican Rome. The other context has to do with Jacobean England, the context in which it's written and performed. So the play is set in 493 BCE, or before Common Era, 4 centuries before Julius Caesar, about whom Shakespeare has already written. Shakespeare wrote Julius Caesar in 1599. So he's going to the prehistory of Caesar's reign. And when we're dealing with Republican Rome, as the name implies, we're dealing with a political system known as a republic, where political rule and government is established, at least in theory, by election. We'll talk about that in a moment. Shakespeare maps that onto the political situation of his own time in Jacobean England, which is not a republic but a monarchy, a situation in which government and rule and national order and politics is, at least for James I, theorized in terms of divine right, which we've talked already about in the course, where the king is seen as God's chosen representative on earth, and the king's body is to be seen and to be granted the same sanctity and holiness as the body of God or the body of Christ itself. So two very different political systems, one the Roman Republic, of before Common Era, and the other the divine right monarchy of early 17th century England. These two systems are always working simultaneously, and at many points are in tension in this play. We can never really disentangle one from the other. We're familiar enough with divine right monarchy from having read the King Lear and the Winter's Tale. So let me say a few things about Roman Republic. A republic, as you may know, is a government in which rulers are elected. And in the Roman system, we have senators and tribunes. We have a division between the plebeians and the patricians. And this means that the affairs of state are, again, at least in theory, public, not secret. And you'll see in this play that the will of the people and the voice of the people and the access to Coriolanus in particular desired by the people is crucial. So crucial that it becomes the condition on which Coriolanus is ultimately banished from Rome. So again, Shakespeare's working with an historical record, and it's an historical record that he gleans in large part from a text called The Lives of major ancient Greek and Roman military figures written by Plutarch in the 2nd century of the Common Era, and importantly translated by Thomas North in the 16th century, the late 16th century, somewhere around 1579. And from reading Plutarch's Lives, Shakespeare would have learned that Coriolanus, the historical Coriolanus, captured Coriolis, from which he gets his name, in 493 BCE. And this capture, Coriolanus's capture of Coriolis, represents the first movement forward away from the notorious rule of the Tarquin kings, who were expelled from Rome in 509 BCE, after Sextus Tarquinius raped Lucretia. And Shakespeare has already written about this material in his poem, The Rape of Lucrece. So Shakespeare's already very familiar with this ancient Roman material. Coriolanus is one of his many Roman plays and poems. Following this, Lucius Junius Brutus led the uprising against the Tarquins. Once they are expelled, Rome is made a republic. We've talked already in this course about imitatio and the art of imitation, where writers such as Shakespeare would take texts and stories familiar to them and reinvent them. And this is as true of the historical record as it is true of plays and poems. So Shakespeare takes Plutarch's Lives, and he takes the account of Coriolanus that he finds in Plutarch's Lives, and he imitates it in the humanist sense of imitatio. He adopts certain things, he keeps certain things the same, and then, of course, he changes and he reinvents a few things. Shakespeare, of course, is never afraid to change his source material. So he changes the story of Coriolanus as recorded in Plutarch's Lives significantly, and here are just two changes. The character of Volumnia, Coriolanus's mother, who becomes very pivotal late in the play, is in Plutarch's Lives very passive. She's quite matronly, quiet, submissive even. In Shakespeare, she becomes strong-willed, severe, proud, martial-minded. She really is the voice of the patriarchal politics that organized the Roman Republic. I've often thought of her as Lady Macbeth on steroids. The second key change is that Coriolanus, by contrast, is more passive in Shakespeare than he is represented in Plutarch. In Plutarch's Lives, he seeks to be elected consul of ancient Rome. In Shakespeare, he is more resistant. He only responds to the ambition of Volumnia, his mother. So in Shakespeare, Coriolanus emerges as a kind of loner figure. He's withdrawn. He shuns the people. He rejects communicating with them and providing for them. I don't know if you've heard or seen or know anything about the new series with Jude Law called The Young Pope. But in that series, you have a papal figure who withdraws himself and keeps himself out of the public eye, much in the manner that Coriolanus does in this play. I'm not sure that The Young Pope is a rewriting of Coriolanus as Shakespeare imagined it, but there's certainly an analogy to be drawn. And the question that this raises for the play is, does such a kind of insular rule work? Coriolanus, of course, stands to be elected to the consulate of ancient Rome, but again, keeping in mind this dual political context, what happens in Republican Rome has consequences, at least in Shakespeare's play, for thinking about Jacobean England. So can a king rule effectively by withdrawing himself from the people? In some ways, this is a question we've already taken up. We've seen it in Measure for Measure. We've seen it again in King Lear. Here, it becomes all the more dire, I think, as Coriolanus willfully shuns the people and offers no method of recourse. He doesn't appoint a deputy. He doesn't return in a friar's disguise. He certainly doesn't divide the kingdoms in any way that King Lear does. He very much wants to be out of the public eye as much as possible. And I would argue that this form of insular government proves quite tragic for him, that it contributes to what we could see as Coriolanus's tragic downfall. This play, as I mentioned, dramatizes, like Lear, like The Winter's Tale, like Measure for Measure, a broken body politic. And so as you move into the play and you read the first two acts for Monday's discussion, you want to think about various ways in which this idea of the body politic is rendered vulnerable. Again, keeping in mind that we're dealing with Republican Rome, Republican system of government, and we're dealing with Jacobean England, whose government and political operations are understood according to the theory of the divine right of kings, and also to the theory of the king's two bodies that we've discussed before, whereby the king not only inhabits his natural body that lives and eats and sleeps and dies, but that at the moment of his anointing, the king inhabits and is inhabited by the metaphysical or mystical body of the king, which is represented in the royal line of succession, the body of the king that never dies, the body of the office. So the plot of Coriolanus unfolds according to four key movements, each of which has a direct impact on the body politic in the play. The first, introduced in Act 1, and we'll talk more about this on Monday, is the grain problem. The problem that the Roman commoners are literally starved. Here we hear Menenius recount the oft-cited fable of the belly, and we have a real economic inequality here, where the commoners feel that they're being gypped by, to put it colloquially, those who have power, those who have money, those who have authority. The people want corn at their own rates. They don't want to have to pay more than they think they should. They are being malnourished not only at the level of the natural body, but also at the level of the body politic. They're being charged at rates that are exorbitant. So they feel taken advantage of. So you begin with a Rome already dominated by this clash between the popular will and the political authorities, and it's the cause of rioting and protest in the streets of Rome. The second plot strand concerns Coriolanus' defeat of Aufidius, the chief enemy of Rome, which brings Rome to victory over the Volsces. Upon Coriolanus' defeat of Aufidius, he is nominated, if you will, to stand for election to the consulate. In other words, Coriolanus is put forward as a candidate to assume real political power in Rome, that his martial valor, his success and his prowess on the battlefield qualify him as a candidate for election. And really, these kinds of nominations were all but a foregone conclusion. The people were led to believe that they had to say. They made a big deal about voicing their endorsement of a candidate, but everybody knew it was a foregone conclusion, which means that in the third plot strand, when Coriolanus is banished from Rome, effectively by the people, this is a really significant thing, that Coriolanus is pushed out of the very Rome that he is appointed to serve, in a move that signals the crumbling, the vulnerability of the body politic. And we'll leave it to future discussions to piece out exactly why Coriolanus is banished from Rome. So Coriolanus comes back to Rome a military hero. He's then exiled from Rome in an act of real shame and a mark of dire vulnerability for this body politic. Once he's exiled, the fourth key movement, he sides then with the enemy Aufidius, until Volumnia, his mother, persuades him to return to Rome, at which point, spoiler alert, he is killed. Aufidius turns against him with conspirators, and Coriolanus is in effect hacked to death, and meets his demise. So this play hinges on critical questions about the limits, the vices, the shortcomings of government, the shortcomings of a political body, whether we're talking about ancient Rome or early modern England. And we want to ask, as we move through the play, at what points the body politic comes undone. 6 lines into the play, Act 1, Scene 1, we are told by a citizen of Rome that Coriolanus is, quote, an enemy to the people. 6 lines into the play, we're already given language that suggests the breaking down of the body politic. Coriolanus is characterized as an enemy to the people. Again, that gap between popular will, the will of the people, and political authority is put on full display 6 lines into the play. As we move through, we'll see that Coriolanus himself, and in particular his subscription to a vision of rule and authority in which the ruler withdraws himself and makes himself aloof from his people, proves quite tragic. So I want to move you into just Act 1, Scene 1, where I've already mentioned that the plebeians in Rome are revolting against the patricians. They're accusing them of literal starvation as well as financial or economic manipulation. We read after we learn that Caius Marcius is chief enemy to the people, in line 10, we are told by the first citizen, let us kill him and we will have corn at our own price. That is what the citizens of Rome want. They want their literal food at rates that they perceive as fair. At line 18, the first citizen continues and says, let us revenge this, meaning the injustice, the economic injustice, let us revenge this with our pikes, ere we become rakes. So let us revenge this with our spears, with our own weapons, before we become pitchforks, before we literally starve, because rakes were thought about as thin, but also before we are sort of hoisted upon our own petard, before we are hoisted by the government and effectively killed from starvation. For the gods know I speak this in hunger for bread, not in thirst for revenge. That's 1:18 to 20. That there's a dire need on behalf of the plebeians here. There's a sense in which that which they see as rightfully theirs is being taken from them. They're not getting food at their own price. And as this first act unfolds, we see a tension here between the ruling parties and the plebeians. The plebeians think they're being taken advantage of. They think they are having corn and grain withheld from them because they're being charged exorbitant and excessive rates. Meanwhile, the powers that be feel that they're a bunch of lazy rogues who stand around and do nothing and don't work for their just earnings. So there's a real disdain here for the plebeians on the part of the patricians. They're often referred to in animalistic terms. They're called, for example, in Act 1, Scene 1, line 26. I'm sorry, Act 1, Scene 1, line 165. Marcius Coriolanus comes in and he refers to the Roman public in such terms. He calls them dogs, he calls them curs, he dismisses them, he says he doesn't want to touch them. He wants absolutely nothing to do with them. Act 1, Scene 1, line 155. What's the matter, you dissentious rogues, that rubbing the poor itch of your opinion make yourself scabs? He continues, who deserves greatness deserves your hate, and your affections are as a sick man's appetite, who desires most that which would increase his evil. He that depends upon your favors swims with fins of lead and hews down oaks with rushes. Coriolanus continues then in line 182, hang 'em, they say. They'll sit by the fire and presume to know what's done in the capital. In other words, these commoners will sit and talk to each other, not having a clue about how politics operates, and presume to know that they do. Who's like to rise, who thrives, and who declines, side factions, and give out conjectural marriages, making parties strong, and feebling such as stand not in their liking below their cobbled shoes. Their cobbled shoes suggesting that their clothing is in tatters and that they are lowbrow or lower class. They say there's grain enough. Would the nobility lay aside their ruth and let me use my sword, I'd make a quarry with thousands of these quartered slaves as high as I could pitch my lance. And this kind of anti-commoner, people, Roman people rhetoric on behalf of Coriolanus continues throughout the first act. So we've got two problems here. One is literal and one is figurative. The literal problem is that people are starving in Rome. Grain is being withheld. The poor are getting poorer as the rich Romans are getting richer. Again, there's a cry from the first citizen at the beginning of the play that they are reacting in hunger for bread, not thirst for revenge. So this is a physical and visceral problem. The commoners even give Coriolanus credit for his military victories. They don't oppose him entirely, but they are starving, right? The other problem, the more figurative problem, the more abstract problem, is that the ruling figure, here Coriolanus, the consul-elect, is mistreating and misfeeding the people. The ruling figure, the rulers who should be putting food and sustenance out to feed the people, the members of their government, the members of ancient Rome, are withholding the grain. They're keeping in that which should go out. So we want to ask what happens when the representatives of the people put their own wealth, their own gain, their own profit ahead of those they are called to serve. Again, this has as much relevance to ancient Rome as it does to Jacobean England. Now, in the 5th century BCE, at the time that Shakespeare is writing about, there are actual corn riots of the kind that are described in Coriolanus. So Plutarch would expose that information. That's where Shakespeare is getting part of the impetus for the Roman riots in the play. But it might interest you to know, if you look at the bottom of this slide here, that there are two key early modern historical contexts that are also informing this play, because starvation and poverty is really on the minds of people in Shakespeare's England. And if you think back to King Lear, I was struck by a passage that Gloucester speaks in Act 4, Scene 1. If you're in your Norton, turn to page 2545. Gloucester says to Edgar, "Here, take this purse, thou whom the heavens' plagues have humbled to all strokes. That I am wretched makes thee the happier. Heavens deal so still. Let the superfluous and lust-dieted man, that slaves your ordinance, that will not see because he does not feel, feel your power quickly. So distribution should undo excess, and each man have enough. Of course, Edgar is disguised here as Tom O'Bedlam, as the thing itself, as humanity reduced to its most basic form. And I was struck by the fact that Gloucester's line, so distribution should undo excess, and each man have enough, was probably the cry of every poor person in England, and there were many of them at the time Shakespeare lived and wrote and had his plays staged. Maybe even the groundlings, who were not completely impoverished because they could afford to go to a play, but certainly were probably doing a hard day's work for an unjust wage, would have heard in Gloucester something they could cling to. If only distribution should undo excess, if only the money could go out to all people instead of being held by a few, and each man have enough. That cry for enough that Gloucester articulates in King Lear is the cry for enough that the plebeians in Coriolanus are also crying for, speaking in hunger for bread and not thirst for revenge. In 1607 and 8, there's an event called the Midland Uprising. When James I takes the throne, he inherits an England plagued by bad harvest and food shortage. And remember the ever-looming threat of the plague, which also contributed to the complete decimation of towns, cities, crops, peoples. That, combined with the bad harvests and the food shortage, makes the talk of hunger and starvation and death at the play's outset quite resonant with members of Shakespeare's audience, especially those who felt this particular kind of pinch in a particular way. And again, I want to say from the outset that when we invoke something like the Midland Uprising of 1607 and 8, this is just a historical context. This is part of the discourse shaping this play. It's not the key that unlocks every line and scene in Coriolanus. It doesn't suggest that the correct meaning of Coriolanus is necessarily tied to the Midland Uprising of 1607 and 8. It simply suggests that this is one context that we could look at to inform our reading of the play. What happened is that food prices go up when James comes to the throne at a time when food prices are going up. So that notion of not being able to afford corn at your own rates is not made up on Shakespeare's audience. They would have felt that pinch. This is only made worse by what are called the Poor Laws of 1598 to 1601. They're laws involving taxation, laws that are not, or laws that were not unknown to England before. In the 14th century, there's an event in 1381 known as the Peasants' Revolt, in which the peasants, the workers, the commoners, rise up against the government because they feel they are being taxed unjustly. And this leads to expansive rioting in the Midlands. The Midlands of England, including Warwickshire. This is important because this is where Shakespeare's family lived, in Stratford-upon-Avon. So the Midland Uprising, this kind of economic resistance, probably would have been known to Shakespeare. If he didn't witness it directly, his family likely did. So these peasant uprisings, due to perceived injustice, economic injustice, shaped the Midland Uprising of 1607. Note the date. Those are the same years in which Shakespeare's play is written and performed. The second historical context has to do with what's called enclosure, which is a very complex economic and geographical phenomenon, but in essence, it's the act of bringing large estates together by driving the peasants away, making it really unaffordable for them to live, and then converting their lands into larger estates. The Crown rejects the peasants' claims about this, but the Privy Council, you might be interested to know, ultimately intervened and reaffirmed laws against enclosure. Again, in other words, the enclosure system made it impossible for peasants to inhabit their lands. They were forced to sell them off and evacuate, and then those lands were consolidated again. So not exactly the same problem that's going on in Coriolanus, but the dynamic is the same. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. Shakespeare plunges us almost mid-conversation into the plebeians' revolutionary language, into the plebeians' uprising against these forms of economic injustice. And at Act 1, Scene 1, around line 62, Menenius comes in and gives a very famous speech where he tries to justify the actions of the government on behalf of the people, one that characterizes Coriolanus and the other rulers from a patrician perspective, and thus in a more favorable light. So the one thing you have to remember is that in this opening act, Shakespeare gives us two versions of the events in ancient Rome. One coming from the plebeians, from the citizens who are irate at their government, the other coming from the patricians, who, like Menenius, justify the way that the leaders and the consuls and the members of the ruling class care for the people. And I'm going to leave off there. We'll begin Monday's class looking at Menenius's Fable of the Belly in detail and thinking about the different ways that the body politic is represented from both plebeian and patrician points of view. But for now, I wanted you to have some of those introductory contexts, again, keeping in mind that we're dealing with both the ancient Roman context that informs the content Shakespeare's working with, and the Jacobean English context that informs the moment in time when Shakespeare's Coriolanus is written and performed. So please make sure you've read through Acts 1 and 2 for Monday, and we'll pick up there with Menenius's Fable of the Belly.